Hey guys, Ark here, bringing to you Chapter 2, Episode 4 of my Learning Night Elf series. This episode, we're going to be covering the Night Elf versus Human match, and I'm going to be really focusing specifically on scouting. I've had a lot of questions specifically related to scouting. That's why I'm kind of jumping gears here from the previous videos and going to be covering. It's going to be a four-part episode where I'm going to be covering each matchup. So human, undead, or versus human, undead, elf, and orc, and specifically going after what are the key things I'm scouting for, when am I going to be making decisions, and so forth. So this is the Night Elf versus human matchup. We're watching a game of Moon versus, oh boy, I probably should have remembered this. It was Moon versus Yumiko. This is actually from one of the WGL Open qualifiers. It might have been the Pro qualifier, but it was like last month, I believe. But we are on Concealed Hill, and so I'm going to let this game go as I'm talking, so try not to get too distracted with it. But essentially, when you're versus human, and this is going to be a Demon Hunter game as well, so I'm going to try and focus specifically on this one matchup. Keep in mind that maybe certain openings or certain movements the elf might do differently depending on what opening they do, but the general concepts are going to be the same because you're still going to be looking for the same decision points. So versus human, it's really imperative that you identify, if you're going Demon Hunter, that you want to basically stick on him, or at least know exactly where he's at, so you are prepared from a movement standpoint. So the level 3 for the AM is very important. It signals to the human that, hey, I can go ahead and get aggressive on the elf base, and if they're not there to stop me, it's not going to be a good day for the elf. So from an elf perspective, you want to make sure that you identify where they're at so that you can prevent them from getting level 3, or at least slow it way down, or at the very least trade for level 3 yourself. It's very difficult to do that in elf versus human. I'd almost say impossible to do it faster, but you can get pretty close, at least close enough that when your second hero gets out, you can at least compete with it. So we'll look real quick at scouting-wise what Moon has seen. So for those of you that are watching the mini-map, you can see that he really stopped short of the human base itself. Those of you that are coming through Reforged may not be aware of this, but they made some changes to human where militia, the militia, peasants no longer stay in militia for as long as they used to. That pretty much has killed the early tier 1 tower rush, which at this level of play really didn't get much use anyways, but now it's effectively eliminated just because of the changes to the militia timer. So it's really not that important that Moon scouts this down this center line. Really what Moon is looking for right at this point is early game movement. So you have a wisp position here and a wisp position here. Specifically on this map, there's two ways to get level 2 that are generally seen. One is through this green camp right here, and the other is through this Murloc camp right here. So Moon knows this, and that's why he's positioning his wisp in such a way that he'll be able to scout out the second creep camp he does, because generally the human is going to creep this. There's no point in the human creeping this because it's less experience, and you don't there's just less experience, and you don't need to militia creep it. This camp is a lot more experience, better overall, and you need a little bit of help creeping it. So you might as well do this first. So that's generally why that's the creep pattern, and that's also catching the scouts, because what if the humans ran cross map at level 1? Well, this Swiss scout still sees that. So we'll unpause and let it go for a little bit. But that's the idea behind why he's not scouting this main base, because he knows that no matter what the human's doing, he doesn't need to respond to anything until he identifies where the human's going second. So we'll speed this up a little bit just to see him scouted out. But I just wanted to explain that part right there. So pause it right here. He's moving this wisp out. He's wanting to try and catch any potential movement around here. He doesn't see any. He's going to start moving this wisp eventually. He is running down the middle as well. So he sees the middle pathway, he sees the bottom pathway, and there we go. He saw the AM. That is the point where he knows that he needs to respond to it. Now, as a new player, one thing I would suggest is doing this initial scout here of the human base. For Moon, it's not really that that big of a deal, and eventually you might get to the point where you don't need to do that. But when you're still at a point where even when you scout something, if you're not fully aware of exactly what he's doing, it could be very helpful for you to know. Now, chances are if he scouted a paladin or he didn't scout a hero, he would have just kept going forward and scouting this and see if there was something weird happening. But as a new player, I would highly suggest just doing this initial scout just to get it in your mind of what you need to be looking for and what it looks like when you do scout. And then eventually make the call yourself that says, hey, this is what I need to do, or this is what I need to see when I need to see it, so I'm going to scout during that time. That's definitely a progress thing. As you get more experience, you'll cut back on some of maybe the wasted movements. So we'll just go ahead and back to the obs, turn off fog. So in the matchup, I mentioned a little bit before, I just paused it. It's a little too loud for me. In the matchup, it's very important to know where the human player is. If you've ever gotten into a point where you've lost track of the human, very, very likely will you be in a position that you're gonna find the human player at your base and you're nowhere near there. You never want to engage the human at your base during these early parts of the game, because it's very difficult for you to keep your wisps alive while also defending moonwells and just the pressure, because I mean archers aren't very strong at fighting straight up, and it's very difficult to defend wisps at the same time as well, especially if they go something like defend. If they get an early defend, that makes it even harder. So any engagement with the human army during the pre-T2 time period, you really want it to be somewhere way far away from your base. So this movement here for Moon kind of makes sense for that. He's not only is he getting scouting information with his army there, he's denying level 3, and at the very least, if the human does creep while this is going on, it's going to be generally slower than if the elf wasn't there, and it will allow him to engage the human outside of his base. So we'll unpause that. So again, these skirmishes are very common in elf versus human up until tier 2, where you get the Naga or something to slow units down. So everything we're seeing here, I would say, is pretty typical and is, again, providing scouting information, engaging the human outside of the elf base, and so forth. The difficult part as the elf player, it's getting a little bit away from scouting here, is knowing how many archers you should build and controlling them. It may seem like they're just 100 gold or 130 gold. They're not really important, but archers are incredibly important. Losing any archers pre-T2 is very impactful. It slows down your creeping. It just feeds unnecessary experience, and it's just a big cost to the elf that it doesn't need to lose. So one of the real challenges also of getting better as an elf player is making sure your micro's on point to not lose those archers. So what we're going to be seeing here is just, again, the continued engagements all throughout tier 2, and I can't stress enough just how important these are. It may seem like not a whole lot's getting done, but we're losing a footy count, so the footy count's going down. We're distracting the human. Can't see my hands. You're distracting the human so he's not creeping 3. And again, you're engaging the human outside of the elf base. So I'm going to speed along through here. We're not going to watch this whole thing. One thing I kind of want to touch on as we get closer, and I kind of consider this a small mistake, and this kind of just absolutely can show you just how difficult it is and how important scouting is in particular in this matchup. So the build that Yumiko did, he went for the defend build with 6 footies, I believe it was. One of them ended up falling. So in his main base, he is doing a tech transition over into rifleman. It's a little bit slower than you typically see for like the classic rifle casters. So from Moon's perspective, and with how prevalent rifle casters is, it's very common to expect rifle casters, but technically he hasn't really seen that yet. But this is just very common, so I won't say too much about it, but we do see it is tier 2, so both players have their second hero. Moon is positioning his Ancient of War to start creeping this camp. There's no wisps in this general vicinity. From Moon's perspective, it looks like both players are going to back off and start creeping. That's generally is the case, But what we see here is Yumiko actually chooses to get aggressive here, which is not a standard thing. And so this is a perfect example of why scouting is so important in this matchup. At this point, he's very weak. Only has 3 archers in the Ancient of War. The Ancient of War is super important for him to catch up in the levels in the wasted time that he had from harassing. And just like that, he loses 1 archer. It gets storm bolted. He does get the big level 2 kill at the very least, but this creep jack is pretty devastating for him. 2 archers down, he's going to lose his AOW, and really Yumiko doesn't lose a whole lot. He's actually going to lose his TP. So one simple thing that could have prevented it, just having scouting information between where you're going to be creeping and likely places for the human. Now, it's very easy to watch this replay and say, oh yeah, of course he should have had a list there. My general guidelines personally is I try to have one at least in, like, if you break this up into like quadrants, like this would be quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. This wisp here would be dedicated towards like scouting this side of the map. And then I like to have one wisp somewhere here that's dedicated solely to scouting this side of the map. Very easier said than done, but I think that's one thing that I would take away from this, is that it's very important to know, I guess, at any stage of the game, roughly where your opponent is. Even if you think he's going to be creeping, until you've confirmed that, during a period where you're weak, you need to know exactly where he's at. So I'm going to pause it there. That's really the last thing I really wanted to cover on this. Just to recap the important things, scouting human versus, or elf versus human. You want to, of course, know his early game opening and his creep routes. The next thing is you want to know whether he's going to be teching or expanding. We didn't really touch on expanding too much, but essentially the Demon Hunter movement in the early parts of this game here, it identified the teching as well as the lack of expanding. We'll probably cover expanding strategy itself, but from a scouting perspective, you just need to know whether he's scouting or he's expanding or teching. If he is teching, well, the important thing is that you need to stay on him, engage the human outside of your base, prevent him from getting level 3, and keep your archers alive as much as you can, and try and deal as much damage as you can to his footmen. So with that said, we're going to call this quits. Thank you for tuning in to this episode. Any feedback you have, anything you guys would like to see differently, please just feel free to let me know in the comments below, or just message me however you want to do it. Thank you again. Take care.